So we don't have to hand these ones in?
Well, I don't think there's any point in handing them in since I did them both. Pretty sure my answers are correct. Okay. Section 9.4 is something called the square root method. What if I asked you to solve x squared equals 9? What would you do?
X equals the square root of 9.
So x is 3. That's half right. We have an x squared. How many answers should there be? There should be 2. Okay, so we have an x squared. How have we always solved equations that have an x squared? What's our first step? No, factor is the second step.
Aren't they perfect squares?
Get everything on one side and have 0 on the other. Okay, so first thing we should do is subtract the 9 and get 0 on one side. Then we factor. Can you factor x squared minus 9?
They're perfect squares.
They are both perfect squares, so it factors as
X minus 3x plus 3.
x minus 3 and x plus 3. So we get 2 answers. What are the 2 answers?
X minus
X equals positive 3 and x equals negative 3. Why is negative 3 a correct answer? When you multiply, negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. Okay, so what do you think this thing called the square root method is all about?
perfect squares.
Not necessarily perfect squares. We had the right idea. What people wanted to do, people wanted to get rid of this square. What gets rid of a square?
Square root.
A square root. What's the square root of 9? 3. What's the other square root of 9?
3.
Negative 3 is the other square root of 9. So, the square root method is we would take the same equation and we would do square roots on both sides. However, on the right hand side, when you do the square root of 9, you need to remember that there are 2 square roots of 9. There's a positive answer and there's a negative answer. So we write a symbol like that, plus or minus. On the left hand side, what do squares and square roots do to each other? They cancel, that's x. On the right hand side, what's the square root of 9? 3, but we have this plus or minus in front of it. So quite often we write our answer that way. X equals, and this says x equals plus or minus 3, which is the same thing that this says. X is 3 or x is negative 3. Now, when you go to do your homework and you go to type it into MyLab, on MyLab there's no little plus minus button. So you're actually going to have to type in x equals 3, comma, x equals negative 3. You have to type it in that way. But typically when we write it by hand, we write it that way. Now, the reason we do the square root method is it allows us to solve equations we couldn't solve by factoring. For example, let's say I changed this problem just a teeny tiny little bit and I made it x squared equals 10. If I tried to do it by factoring, I would have x squared minus 10 equals 0, and I would have a problem. Does x squared minus 10 factor? No, x squared minus 10 doesn't factor. So can we solve this one by the factoring method? No. And this is what we're going to be dealing with for the next couple sections is how do we solve equations that don't factor? And our first way is we use the square root method. So the square root method would tell me to do what?
Square root x and square root 10.
Square root x squared and square root 10. But if I wrote what I just wrote, the mean teacher is going to mark it wrong. You got to have 2 square roots. There's got to be 2 answers. So we need a positive square root and we need a negative square root. Okay? That's the biggest thing people forget. Answer should be x is plus or minus the square root of 10. Questions on that? All right. How about if I asked you to solve three x squared equals 15? What would you do?
gotta get the x squared by itself, right?
Absolutely. Why do you want to get the x squared by itself?
Because you're solving for x.
Because I'm solving for x. What I really want to do is do a square root. If I do a square root right now on the left-hand side, what's the square root of 3? Not a nice, pretty thing, is it? You're absolutely right. What you want to do first with these problems is you want to get the x squared thing all by itself. In other words, we want to take and we want to divide both sides by 3. What do you do after you divide both sides by 3?
Square root of both.
Square root of both. So we're going to have square root of x squared.
Don't forget your plus and minus.
Don't forget my plus or minus. Very good. Final answer? X is plus or minus the square root of 5. Questions on that? All right, how about solve? 2x squared minus 10 equals, I want a nice number here. How about 40?
Add the 10 to both sides.
Why do you want to add the 10 to both sides?
You're trying to get the x squared by itself.
Correct. Before you can do square roots, you've got to get the square thing all by itself. So you should start on this one by adding 10 to both sides. X squared is 2x squared is
50.
50. And then
Divide by 2.
divide by 2. So x squared is 25.
Yes, you would take the negative. Oh, never mind. Take it out.
Okay. Next step,
Square root sides.
square root both sides. Thank you. Don't forget those plus or minuses.
X equals plus minus square root of 5.
Not plus or minus square root of 5.
Oh, that's 5.
Just plus or minus 5. The square root of 25 happens to be a very nice number. The square root of 25 is 5. It happens to work out perfectly, so we're not going to have a square root symbol anymore. We're just going to have x equals plus or minus 5. Questions on that one?
If it's not a perfect square, then the square root symbol remains.
If it's not a perfect square, then we will leave the square root symbol. Yep. All right, how about, parenthesis here, 2x minus 1 squared equals, oh, I don't know, 29.
Would you square the parentheses first and then transfer it over?
Would I square the parentheses first and then transfer it over? Let's try that. See what happens. I will warn you. This is a bad way to do this problem.
Is it okay?
It is. And we'll see why in a second. What do you get when you take 2x minus 1 times 2x minus 1?
4x squared minus 2x plus 1.
Close. 4x squared minus 4x plus 1. So just try it. If you don't remember, there was a little shortcut for that. If you don't remember it, write down 2x minus 1, write down 2x minus 1, and just distribute and add up all your like terms. I promise you, you'll get 4x squared minus 4x plus 1 equals 29. Now what?
Get everything over.
You got to have 0 on one side, so you would subtract the 29. 4x squared minus 4x minus 28 equals 0. Now, can we factor?
Well, 4.
When I say the word factor, the first thing you should think of is GCF. Is there a GCF?
4.
4. So I take the 4 out. I'm left with x squared minus x minus 7 equals 0. In order to be able to solve, we need to factor more. We need to be able to factor the x squared minus x minus 7. Can we factor x squared minus x minus 7?
No.
No. So what does that mean?
This is wrong.
We did a lot of work that doesn't do us any good. Why not?
It's prime.
It's prime. If we can't factor, we can't solve. So we didn't do anything wrong. It's just we're to a point where we're stuck. We can't factor, so we can't solve. That's why that's the bad way. Doesn't work. That's really bad. Come back on Friday and we'll learn how to fix this. There is a way. But here's what you really want to do on this one. In general, if you have a parenthesis like this with a square, multiplying it out is usually a very bad thing to do. It usually makes life a lot harder for you. Rather, what you really want to do is get rid of that square. How do you get rid of a square? Do a square root. I'm going to square root both sides. Remembering, of course, that on the right hand side I do have two square roots. What happens on the left hand side?
It becomes just 2x minus 1.
The square and the square root cancel each other out. Yeah, that's the whole idea. We have 2x minus 1 equals plus or minus square root of 29. Can you get the x all by itself now? Yeah. What would you do?
Add 2 to the other side and divide it by divide the other side by 2.
You said add 2. I think you meant add 1.
No. Okay. I meant add 1.
Yeah, I think you meant add 1. So we add 1 to both sides. Typically, we would write it as 2x equals 1 plus or minus square root of 29. And then you're absolutely right, we divide by 2. So typically, we would write our answer as 1 plus or minus square root of 29 all over 2.
Now, see, I would have done 2x. I would have done 2x equals 30, but you can't do it because they're not like terms. Because one's
They're not like, one has a square root and one does not.
so
Yep, they're not similar terms. You can't add those together.
Plus the square root of 29.
Again, when you're doing your homework on MyLab, you're going to have to type in one answer as 1 plus square root of 29 over 2. And then your second answer, you would type in as 1 minus square root of 29 over 2. It's going to force you to type in two separate answers. There's no little plus minus button, unfortunately.
That's your job.
But it should remind you that I got to have two answers. So if you only have one, you forgot your little plus or minus, and it should remind you of that. So it's kind of a good thing in a way. Because it's tempting to look at this answer and think I only have one answer. But there's really two answers there, one with the plus, one with the minus. Questions on that? All right, how about 2 times 3x plus 1 squared minus 5 equals 11.
Add 5.
Add 5, why?
Oh, so you can get rid of the square later.
Eventually you want to get rid of the square. In order to get rid of the square, first you need to get the,
Square root.
well, you want to do the square root eventually. I need to, before I can do square root, I need to get rid of this 5 and I need to get rid of this 2. I need to get this thing that has the square all by itself alone before I can do square roots.
Add 5 and divide by 2.
So we want to add 5 first. 2 times 3x plus 1 squared equals 16. And then we divide by 2. 3x plus 1 squared equals 8. Now what? Now we square root. When I square root, typically we skip a step here. When I square root, what's going to happen on the left hand side? The square root is going to just get rid of that square, isn't it? Michael?
How did you get the 8?
I divided both sides by 2.
Oh, you divided
We divided both sides. All right, so typically when we do the square root, we just write on the left-hand side, we're going to have 3x plus 1. The square root's going to cancel the square. And on the right-hand side, what do we have? Plus or minus
Plus or minus the square root of 8.
square root of 8. Okay, so we had to do a couple steps to get the square thing all by itself. Then we do square roots. Now we got to do a couple steps to get the x all by itself. So what would you do to get the x all by itself? Do what? You could divide by 3, but usually we subtract the 1 first. You can divide by the 3 first, but when you divide by 3, you got to do it everywhere, and that's going to give you a fraction right there, and we don't want to do that to ourselves. So we're going to subtract the 1. Typically, we would write 3x equals negative 1 plus or minus square root of 8. And then we divide by 3. Answer would be x equals negative 1 plus or minus square root of 8 all over 3. Questions on that? All right, I want to do one more problem. Make it easier on myself here. I don't know, give me some numbers.
6.
6x
9.
minus 9 squared minus 3 equals 22. How would you begin?
Plus 3.
Plus 3 on both sides. Okay, so 6x minus 9 squared equals 25. Square root it. So 6x minus 9 equals plus or minus square root of 25. But square root of 25 happens to be a really nice number, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
What's the square root of 25?
5.
5. So when that happens, when the square root goes away, like it does here, typically what we do at this point is we split it into two problems. We write 6x minus 9 equals 5, 6x minus 9 equals negative 5, and we're going to get two fairly nice answers. We're not going to have any square roots left. Typically we split it when we have nice answers, and we simplify it and we get our nice answers.
We don't have to go through all the square root stuff.
Correct. You don't have to go through the square root stuff. It's gone. So we just split it into two problems and get our two nice answers. We have the 9. 6x is 14. So x is 14 over 6, but I can reduce. That would be 7 over 3. And this one over here, we would add the 9. 6x is 4. So x is 4 over 6. And again, I would reduce that to be 2/3. So when that square root is a nice number, split it up, write down your two answers. You should get two fairly nice answers. I mean, you're going to get fractions most of the time, but that's okay.
Will they always be different usually?
Yes, they will almost always be different. And that's the mistake people make. People like to solve the one with the positive 5 and write 7/3, and then they'll write negative 7/3 as the other answer. But it doesn't work that way. Questions?